So here's the thing. In modern commercial fiction, dialogue is often around 30 to 50% of the text. Internal monologue, character thoughts, can range from 10 to 30% of the text. The rest of it, exposition, narration, description, is the remainder, around 30 to 50%. Now there are a ton of influencing factors like the genre. Thrillers and romances tend to have higher amounts of dialogue. Romance tends to outweigh thrillers in terms of the internal monologue. Or you might be writing an epic fantasy, which might have a lower amount of dialogue and internal monologue because you're writing about the world itself and trying to portray that, which is not familiar to the reader in the beginning. The POV you choose for your story will also affect how much dialogue there is. First person and close third person naturally involve more internal monologue than, say, omniscient point of view. And then there's your basic style. Writers like Stephen King, Joe Abercrombie, John Scalzi, Chuck Wendig, they favor rapid-fire dialogue and are lighter on exposition. Whereas writers like Robin Hobb, Guy Gavriel Kay, George Martin, John Gwynne, they favor deeper internal exploration and more lavish description. Whatever your style and whatever your genre, anything that takes up half or more of your story is important to get right. So in this video, we're going to break down dialogue, how it works, how to use it to reveal character, how to make the scene come alive during the dialogue, and plenty more, so stick around. Hey, if you're new to the channel, I'm Brad Bollier, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author with a dozen novels, tons of short stories, and 20+ years of experience in the field of writing. I started a novel approach to share some of the hard-learned lessons I've learned about writing, editing, publishing, and the business of writing. If any of that sounds up your alley, be sure to subscribe, and if you find this video useful, I hope you'll like, share, maybe even buy me a coffee on ko-fi.com. Link in the description below. Okay, so let's dive into writing dialogue. We're going to cover a detailed breakdown of dialogue, internal monologue, and physical beats, and we'll give a number of examples from a piece of fiction for each of those, and then I'll give you some tips, tricks, and things to avoid for each of those components. Again, dialogue, internal monologue, and physical beats, and then also talk about how dialogue needs to change based on the situation. And finally, we'll wrap up with additional thoughts and some suggestions for improvement for your own fiction. And the case study we're going to use in this case is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a New York Times best-selling cozy adventure fantasy. It's a short book, a very easy read, which I highly recommend. Grab it, it'll help you a ton to digest what we're talking about here, and it's a really good story. It's emotional and immersive, it has a very economical use of words, and it has great examples of dialogue, which we'll see. So what can dialogue do? We're going to start by showing the various things that dialogue can accomplish, and we'll do it with a number of excerpts from Legends and Lattes, and don't worry if you haven't read it, I'm going to set things up and I'll explain as we go along, and I've also ordered them in sequence so that you start to get a sense of the progression of the story as we go through the examples. For each excerpt, I'll give one primary purpose, but there will be more. And I urge you to either pause or maybe watch this a second time to really digest things and try to pick out other purposes of the examples that I'm giving, because that will help you to start digesting what your own dialogue is doing, what others are doing, so that you can better learn and apply that to your fiction. Legends and Lattes is about a character named Viv who is an ex-mercenary who wants to change her life. She's really good at being a mercenary, but she's sick of the grind, the blood, and the guts that go along with that job. And she wants to do something she really loves, open a coffee shop, and the prologue sets her on that path. Although this is couched in fantasy, it's an extremely relatable story with modern sensibilities. Most of us probably have been at a job where we really don't enjoy it and we want to do something that we love, that's a calling for us, instead of a grind of corporate life or something in the trades where you really don't enjoy it. And so breaking away from that and doing something you really want to do is something I think we can all relate to. And that's one of the reasons it did so well. So I mentioned in the prologue that Viv gets this magical stone, and she uses it to guide her like a divining rod towards a particular city called Thun and a broken down livery. And so this is the initial description before we get to the dialogue. It was small for what it was. A battered sign hung from the single remaining iron eye hook. Parkin's livery. The paint of the embossed letters long since flaked away. There were two large iron-bound wooden doors, but they were ajar, and the crossbeam was leaning against the wall nearby. Another smaller, orc-sized door was amusingly padlocked to the left of it. So here we come to the first example. Dialogue can reveal immediate scene goals. Viv strode across the street. The old woman, who we learn is Lainey, had the good grace to appear surprised, mustering something approaching a smile as she did. "Do you know who owns this place?" asked Viv, pointing back at the livery. The only bit of dialogue here is, do you know who owns this place? In a previous video I made on creating the perfect scene, which you can see in the link up above, I talk about what a scene should accomplish. And part of the pattern that you must set, generally speaking, is having the statement of a goal up front, and then you introduce and develop conflict, and then finally you have the failure of the character to reach his or her goal, a tactical disaster. There are exceptions to these rules, but that's generally speaking what you want to do, and you want to try to give the reader a sense of what the character is trying to accomplish early in a scene, and that's what's going on here. Viv has found this livery through the stone that she got in the prologue, and now she needs to buy it, but she has to figure out who owns it first, and that's what's going on here. That's the statement of that goal. Dialogue can also help transport the reader. So Lainey says, "The livery?" "Yep." "Well," she dragged the word out thoughtfully, but Viv could tell there was nothing wrong with her memory. "That's old Ansem, if I recollect properly. Never had much of a head for business, that man. Not for trade nor husband's work neither, to hear his old lady tell of it. Any idea where I can find him? Couldn't say for certain, but I imagine attendant to the only work he never failed at." She tipped her free hand, bringing an imaginary tankard to her lips. "If you really want to find him, I'd try the places on Rawbone Alley. Head about 6 over. She gestured to the south. And so here, one of the jobs you have to do very early on in your story is to start pulling the reader in. And I picked this example because Lainey is small and cute and wrinkled, and she also loves to gossip. And we can just see the kind of person she is. And this short exchange that we have is starting to do that, showing us what kind of world we're being drawn into and the characters who inhabit it. And so things like this go a long way to drawing you in and making you feel like this is a lived-in place. It's not just an answer, go down to Rawbone Alley and find this certain pub. Baldry portrayed this in such a way that we get an idea of who Lainey is along the way. And so that's what you want to do in your fiction as well. Dialogue can also create mood. In this case, it's cozy and humorous. "At this time of morning?" Viv asks. "Oh, this business he's serious about." "Thanks, miss," said Viv. "Oh, miss, is it?" cackled the woman. "You can call me Lainey. You planning to be my new neighbor?" She made a give-it-over motion. Viv, said Lainey, nodding. We've seen a bit of this already by the time we get here, but this is just deepening the mood, showing a cute little humorous exchange between these two women. Dialogue can also reveal character, one of its main jobs. So Viv goes and finds the pub where Ansem is at, and she opens the exchange. "You Ansem?" asked Viv. Ansem allowed that he was. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, and then sat anyway, leaning Blackblood against the back of the chair. Truth be told, she wasn't really accustomed to asking permission. In this case, "Mind if I sit" is the dialogue, and it doesn't accomplish the reveal character on its own. It goes along with the physical beat of "then sat anyway," so she sat anyway and leaned her sword, Blackblood, against the back of the chair, so that's a physical beat. And then we have an internal monologue. Truth be told, she wasn't really accustomed to asking permission. So those three components, dialogue, physical beat, and internal monologue, are all in this one short paragraph. And those are the main components of any scene. You're going to be weaving back and forth between dialogue, internal monologue, and physical beats to keep your scenes alive. And one of your goals in general is to only use those components. If you have narrative summary, it's sometimes necessary, but often it's not. Maybe you can pull that content, whatever it is, into the actual interactions, the words and actions that people are using between each other instead of summarizing things or having some sort of info dump or dropping in large amounts of setting instead of using physical beats to have the characters interact with the setting and use that to help the scene come alive. So keep that in mind as we go along. Dialogue, internal monologue, and physical beats are constantly being used in orchestrated fashion to help the scene come alive and do things like reveal character. I also want to touch quickly on world, character, plot interaction. We're talking about an actual scene here where characters are interacting with one another, But I've talked about in other videos about how character, world, and plot constantly play against one another during the ideation phase of your novel, during the brainstorming, plotting, writing, and editing phases as well. And here's a case where we have a character who is an ex-mercenary. Mercenaries have to come from the world that they live in, right? There has to be conflict for mercenaries to exist. And so we're pulling in the world as well. Who was Viv fighting for example? Who was she fighting against? A lot of that stuff may not be revealed in the story, and in fact it isn't, but we get a very good sense that Viv is in fact a mercenary, and you should understand where that came from, why they were a mercenary. And it also very much affects plot. She has to be sick of that grind for her to want to be able to switch careers to opening up a coffee shop. So you can start to see how those three play against one another, and then you have to show it on the page, and dialogue is one of the ways that we do that. Dialogue can also ratchet up tension. I hear you own the livery on Redstone. That true? Asked Viv. Ansem allowed that he did. I'm looking to buy, she said, and have a feeling you might be looking to sell. Ansem seemed surprised, but only briefly. His gaze sharpened, and while he might not have a head for business, Viv was pretty sure he had one for haggling. Maybe, he rumbled, but that's some prime real estate. Prime. I've had offers before, but most of them don't see past the place to really appreciate the value of the location. That is to say, they underbid. And so here we have a brief exchange that shows Ansem as a haggler, and it's also starting to put up roadblocks to the goal of getting that livery that Viv really wants. Also note that in the short internal monologue, Viv was pretty sure he had one for haggling. She was right, and that shows her as a good judge of people. And that came from her mercenary past. She has to be able to size up people quickly to stay alive. This past that Viv has of being a mercenary is a theme that's used over and over again to paint Viv as someone who is worldly wise and dangerous to mess around with. Dialogue can also create an emotional response in us, the reader. Viv leaned on an elbow and slid 8 platinum chits across the table. That's probably 80 gold sovereigns. I think that covers the value of the lot. I'm sure we can agree that the building is a loss, and I think the odds of another businesswoman tracking you down to pay cash on the barrelhead is vanishing. She held his gaze. He still had the tankard to his mouth, but wasn't swallowing. Viv began to withdraw the chits, and he hurriedly reached out, pulling up short before touching her much larger hand. She raised her eyebrows. I can see you've got a keen eye for value, Ansem blinked rapidly. I do. If you want to take a moment this morning to bring the deed and sign it over, I'll wait here, but I won't wait longer than noon. Turned out the old badger was a lot nimbler than he looked. Here we're seeing Viv succeed in the scene goal. She has found Ansem, she has haggled with him, and she has won that haggle in essence. She has got the property that she wants. And the reason it's creating an emotional response is because A, we understood what Viv was looking for, so we set the scene goal properly. We built tension along the way. Will Viv get the livery or not? And here we deliver. We have this turned out the old badger was a lot nimbler than he looked. That is Viv kind of taking the moment in, like, I got him, right? And we feel that as the reader too. And so that's creating that emotion in us, satisfaction. Dialogue can create sympathy. As Viv made her mark on the deed and pocketed the keys, Ansem scooped the platinum into his purse. Looking relieved, the deal was complete. So, I didn't figure you to be interested in livery work, he ventured. I'm not. I'm opening a coffee shop. Ansem looked nonplussed. But why would you buy a horse stable for that? Viv didn't answer that for a moment. Then she stared hard at him. Things don't have to stay as what they started out as. She folded the deed and tucked it into her satchel. And so that little bit, things don't have to stay as what they started out as. That is about Viv. She is thinking about herself and what she wants to change about herself. It comes out as dialogue about something else, but it's performing double duty. It's giving us a glimpse into her notion of what life should be about and her wanting to make this change and being brave enough to do it in the end. And so that's a very insightful comment, and that creates sympathy in us for Viv as she's struggling to make this change. She now has what she needs, but she's on the beginning of a long journey to make this business work. Jumping ahead. So Viv buys the livery and now needs help in renovating it. She goes to the docks to find a woodworker to help her. And we come to this bit. A few hours on, a man of smaller stature appeared, hauling a wooden box of tools half as large as himself. We jump ahead. He labored alone at a small dinghy, while shipwrights and dock workers alike avoided him. And then she polished off her apple and watched him at his work, trying not to be too conspicuous about it. Lurking was a well-used part of her skill set, after all. And so this is set up for more dialogue to come and more purposes for dialogue. So dialogue can amuse. I mentioned this was a cozy adventure fantasy. It's also humorous. Not really laugh out loud, but cute. "It's nice work," said Viv to Cal, the woodworker that she found. "At least I expect it is. I don't know much about boats," she admitted. "I expect that dulls the compliment a touch then," he replied, his voice dry and deeper than she'd expected. So just a funny little exchange between them. She compliments his work but doesn't really know much about woodworking, and he calls her out on it, just in a chiding kind of way. We can amuse our readers along the way, and that can be important, of course, in something that you're trying to make humorous, but it can also be important in darker fiction. Having something to lighten the mood can make the darker bits darker, so try to work that in as well. Dialogue can replace narrative summary. Cal comments on Viv's lack of experience in woodworking, and she says, "Well, you're right, I don't. But wood's wood and craft's craft. I watched you work. Live long enough, you realize some folks can be handed a problem and some tools and they'll sort it out. And I never think twice about hiring that sort of fellow." Although, she reflected, the tools and fellows had been historically a lot larger and a lot bloodier. Jumping forward a bit, like I said, I watched you work. Sharp tools, you clean as you go, your mind's on your business. She looked around at the conspicuous absence of men nearby. And you do it even when some might say it's wiser not to. The parts I want to call out here is, "I watched you work." And she does that twice. She mentions it again and she embellishes. Now, we did see her watching him and we got some sense of what he was like as a woodworker, a worker in general, really, as he was working on that dinghy. The point here is that you can summarize things that a character saw that might be completely off screen. You can have them comment on it in dialogue so that the reader gets a sense of what happened in the past. You don't have to jump to narrative summary. You can just put it in dialogue instead and get it out more easily, more economically, make it feel like this scene is alive instead of sort of stopping things in time while you go back and talk about what happened in the past and then going back into the scene. Try to get as much of that as you can into the dialogue. Dialogue can reveal or embellish setting. "Rack and ruin," Cal swore under his breath. He removed his cap to tuck it into the top of his breeches. They stood outside Parkin's livery, the stable doors thrown wide, and Viv experienced a momentary twist of uneasiness. "Don't know much about roofing," he said as he peered up at the hole. "But you can figure it out?" He replied, in what Viv was coming to understand was an affirmative. So here we have a couple of things. "Rack and ruin," Cal swore under his breath. That is an indication that this place, this livery, is in bad shape. And he sees it immediately, right? And so then Viv starts to get a bit nervous. And then he says, "Don't know much about roofing." And he peers up at the hole in the roof. Both of those things give us a sense of just how bad a shape this livery is in without going into a ton of detail. So the dialogue is taking the place of a bunch of description. We don't have to go into as much detail because of his reaction. His reaction as an expert in woodworking tells us just how bad this place is and just how much work they're going to have to put into it to turn it into Viv's dream of a coffee shop. Dialogue can also further plot. He, Cal, peered back at her. "How many are you planning to hire? You have someone you like to work with? I'm not opposed. Other than that, I'm a ready pair of hands and I don't tire easy." She held them up in demonstration. "It's not a livery I'm wanting, though." "No? Ever hear of coffee?" He shook his head. "Well, I need a restaurant, I guess, for drinks." We know Viv has purchased the livery and that she wants this coffee shop, but she doesn't have the know-how to complete it. She needs Cal, and we don't have his agreement to work with her yet, but we're starting to get the sense that he's open to the idea at this point. And so this is just kind of encapsulating where things are. She has a place, she needs him to help finish it, and she's going to open the coffee shop one way or the other. And so by her pulling him in, we're starting to get a sense of what this is going to take. She has a lot of work yet to do to get this place renovated, up and running, and then become a successful business in this city of Thune. Dialogue can also reveal backstory. Viv retrieves drawings of a coffee shop she visited back in this city called Azimuth. She's still talking to Cal and trying to give him a better sense of what she's looking for. She found herself rambling. "I came across it in Azimuth, the gnomish city out in the East Territory. Was there for Well, it doesn't matter what I was there for, but I smelled it first, and I came across this shop, and they made, well, it's like tea, but not like tea. It smells like... She stopped. And it doesn't matter what it smells like. I can't describe it anyway. At any rate, imagine I'm opening a tavern, but with no taps, no kegs, no beer. Just tables, a counter, some room in the back. Here, I did some sketches of the place I saw. She thrust the papers at him and felt color rising in her cheeks. Ridiculous. And so there's actually a lot going on here. We're seeing a lot about Viv herself. She's a little bit embarrassed about the drawings that she made, but we're being told about Azimuth, this place that she went to, this gnomish city out in the East Territory, and we never see that on the page. We don't see her go there. This is all backstory that she's filling in dialogue. And so you can do that as well in your story. And we see a lot that's going on here. Her first spark is kind of intimated here of her love of coffee. I mean, she really loves it, obviously, right? Because she wants to give up her old life and start this coffee shop. And it also reveals a lot about her visit to that city without us ever having to go there. So just a very economical way of revealing backstory. Dialogue can help take stock and make plans. She'd half expected him to turn on his heel and leave. Viv talking about Cal. But now she was beginning to think she might have chosen just right. So, he walked around the space again. Seems like you could keep the stalls, cut them down some, tear out the doors, box it in along the walls for benches, take some long planks, set them on a trestle in between. Then you got yourself some booths and tables here along the sides. Tear down that wall into the office. The counter might do. Need to check for rot. He kicked at the splintered wood from the ladder and raised his eyebrows at her. Gonna need a new ladder. Couple bags of nails, whitewash, paint, clay tile, some riverstone, bags of lime. Might want a few more windows in the place. And a lot of lumber. And so here we're getting the sense that, again, Cal has not yet agreed to join her, but we'd kind of know that he's going to when he starts talking about everything that she needs, right? But it also serves to show where we stand with this livery, just how much work it needs and what they're going to need to get and purchase in order to do that. So again, just one example from this story, but you can do that kind of thing as well. Just digest where things stand and the characters can make plans so that the reader understands what's happened so far and how far they have yet to go to get what they want. You know, maybe a turning point in the story, maybe partway through the story in terms of the goals that they're searching for at whatever point in the story, or maybe the final goal, the final resolution of that story, whatever it is. Dialogue can help reveal scene results. So, you'll do it? Viv asks. He gave her another one of his long, speculative looks. What did you say? I do things when it seems wiser not to? Well, if you're helping, I guess so. Give me some of that parchment and a stylus if you've got it. We're going to need a list. A long list. Tomorrow we can see about getting the orders filled and how much flatter we can make that purse of yours. So here, finally, this particular scene was about getting Cal to join her. She needs somebody. She's not a woodworker. She has to have somebody taking the lead there. She's going to be a helper, but she wants Cal to renovate this place for her. And so here he's finally agreed. Everything up to this point was sort of teasing whether or not he would be a right fit for her and vice versa, and now we come to the result. He's going to help, and they have some direction, and then we go to the next scene. Dialogue can digest scene results. So we have the scene results from a moment ago. Viv goes to a pub, so Cal leaves, and Viv just wants to get a bite to eat after her successful day. So she goes to a pub, a very busy one, and she talks to the owner of that establishment. He drops off some food for her. Before you go, she said, I wanted to ask, is this your place? The half-elf blinked and then smiled a little wider than his regular professional pleasantness. Sure is. 4 years now. If you don't mind me asking, how'd you get started? He leaned on the bar top. Well, it's not a family business, if that's what you're asking. And my first place sure wasn't here on High Street. He chuckled at that. And was business slow at first, or did they come all at once? She waved at the room. Oh my, slow. Very slow. Fair to say I lost more money than I could afford to. Then I lost some more. But these days I lose just enough to get by. You planning to open a pub around here? Can't say I'd advise it. He winked at her, clearly joking. Viv just came off a high of getting the livery that she wanted and then getting the woodworker that she wanted. And now she is being struck by reality. This conversation makes her realize that the road to opening a successful business is going to be a very long and hard one. And she's getting a little bit nervous at this point. And that's what this dialogue is accomplishing for us. It's taking us from this high and reintroducing conflict, this tension of, will she be able to do this? Will she be able to make this business succeed? Okay, so let's wrap this up a little bit for dialogue before we go into internal monologue and physical beats. So that was a lot of what dialogue can accomplish, those different purposes that I gave for each example, but it wasn't exhaustive. Like all parts of your story, dialogue has to pull its own weight. And that means it must further character, world, plot, backstory, heighten tension and emotion, and more. So you have to work hard in all parts of your fiction, and certainly dialogue, to make it do double, triple, quadruple duty. And if you go back and look at the examples that I gave, those sections are definitely doing more than a single thing. And so I urge you again to go back and look at and see if you can identify other purposes than the ones I gave. But this is what you want from your dialogue. You want your words to work hard, right? To further the story and create mood, create tension, etc. So let's go to internal monologue. Internal monologue is one of narrative fiction's greatest strengths. Hearing a character's thoughts and experiencing their emotions firsthand allows us to sink into them very deeply. It creates a suspension of disbelief the better that you write your story, and allows the reader to sink into a form of hypnosis and become the characters, right? That's what we do when we read, and that's what you're trying to create for your readers. So internal monologue can do many, if not all, of the same things dialogue can do, so I'm not going to cover all of those again. I'm going to focus on the things that internal monologue does especially well, and that are kind of awkward or difficult to do in dialogue. So internal monologue can help digest events. So here we have, well, that's all right then. Eat up now or it'll get cold. So she's talking to that pub owner. Viv quietly ate her meal and didn't speak to anyone else. Her mood was meditative as she left the pub. She found a chandler's shop, still open, bought a lantern, and returned to the livery. There she lay awake, staring into its flame. The visions of what might someday be were far from the cold and derelict place where she bedded down. Tomorrow, though, the real work would begin. And so that dialogue went some way to portraying the road that she has to travel as a long and hard one, but this goes further. It shows her internal thoughts. She's starting to worry about just how much she has to do and whether or not she's going to be good at it. And specifically, the visions of what might someday be were far from the cold and derelict place where she bedded down. So the livery is currently cold and derelict, right? And so it just gives a sense of how far she has to go and her worry over it. And does it really economically and in a way that makes us sympathize for her. But also, right at the end, she says, tomorrow, though, the real work would begin. So she's certainly not giving up. She is ready for the challenge, and she's going to meet it. Internal monologue can embellish outward actions. We had that previous example of her meeting Ansem. You Ansem? Asked Viv. Ansem allowed that he was. Mind if I sit? She asked, and then sat anyway, leaning black blood against the back of the chair. Truth be told, she wasn't really accustomed to asking permission. So I mentioned earlier that there's three parts here. Mind if I sit is the dialogue. Sitting anyway and leaning her sword against the chair was the physical beat, and then the internal monologue is, truth be told, she wasn't really accustomed to asking permission. One of the best ways to show characters to have internal monologue be a contrast to dialogue. And so she asks semi-politely if she can sit, and then she sits anyway. And then we have this internal monologue of she wasn't really accustomed to asking permission. So that gives some sense of what she's like, and it stems directly from her past as a mercenary. She's brash, and she goes after what she wants, and she's even a bit scary at times. And so we're starting to get a sense of that, her confidence. Internal monologue can show self-awareness. So Viv starts working on the livery, and at one point, filth covered Viv from head to toe, and the livery's interior looked like a sandstorm had passed through, with little dunes and drifts of dirt having resettled after the disturbance. She thought with amusement that she should hire Lainey to broom it out, but when she looked in that direction, the old woman was absent. There was, however, someone else shadowing her doorway. Viv's back prickled with a sense she trusted implicitly. It was the reason she was still moving around and breathing, after all. And so we're about to meet someone called Lack, who is a shakedown artist. He is about to offer protection, mafia style, for Viv's new business. And Viv immediately understands the sort of guy he is, her back prickled with a sense that she trusted implicitly. And it was the reason she was still moving around and breathing. And so again, we're getting a sense of her mercenary life. She has had to size people up quickly in her former life as a mercenary, and this gives one small glimpse of it. And so she's aware of that. She understands it and she trusts it. So it gives a sense of her past and what that made her into, the sort of woman she is now because of it. Internal monologue can reveal deeper understanding. Help you with something? She asked of Lack, that she'd just met, dusting off her hands and thinking about Blackblood leaning up in the loft, out of reach. He was dressed stylishly, with a ruffled shirt, a vest, and a broad-brimmed hat, but on closer inspection, his clothing was worse for wear, sweat-stained and a little frayed. His skin had the gray cast of one of the stone fae, and his features were sharp. "Oh, no help required," he replied. "We like to welcome budding entrepreneurs to the city when we can, and I'm powerfully curious about what new business you'll bring to the district." His voice was smooth, almost cultured. Viv didn't miss the reference to a nebulous we. And so, in this case, Viv is picking up on who this guy is right away. She already has the spidey sense tingling, right? That he's maybe a danger, but she doesn't know what kind of danger. But now she understands we like to welcome budding entrepreneurs. So there's more than one of him, and they're probably shakedown artists, right? She already knows before he even really says it. Internal monologue can strengthen relationships. Well, that's true, Viv said. Still, for all that, not sure I can roll over for a little man in a big hat and a silly shirt. Lainey chuckled darkly. Never mind the man in the hat. The madrigal's what you want to worry about, and nothing silly about them. I'll be careful, said Viv. They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes. Viv glanced sidelong at Lainey's mug of tea. Say, you ever have coffee? She asked. Lainey blinked at her and looked affronted. Why, I never have, and the way I was brought up, a lady doesn't talk about her maladies, she said primly. Viv barked a laugh, to the old woman's great annoyance. Here we have Viv and Lainey talking, and Lainey is giving her a bit of advice about the city and who the madrigals are, and then at the end, there's a misunderstanding. Lainey doesn't know what coffee is, and Viv is sort of, again, brash and confident enough. She kind of doesn't care what other people think about her, and she thinks it's funny, so she barks a laugh, and to the old woman's great annoyance. So Viv is rough around the edges enough to do something like that, and the scene ends here, but you can imagine these two clearing up the misunderstanding. Viv tells her what coffee is like, and they share some more between them. And so we're starting to strengthen their connection with each other, Viv and the local gossip, Lainey. Internal monologue can also deepen emotional state. When they were back down and inside, listening to the drops clatter lightly overhead, Cal said, Well, maybe no deliveries today, unless the rain slacks off. He looked around the barren interior. A good job of it, eh? Looks a fair bit bigger now. So they've cleaned a bunch of stuff out, and they're kind of ready to do the actual work. Viv smiled ruefully as she surveyed the place. The emptiness of it somehow made the work to come more daunting. Think I'm a fool? And so here again, Viv is slightly unsure of herself. She has kind of a queasy feeling about whether or not this is going to work, and it's amplified by the emptiness of the place they just cleared out. So we can show, and not just can show, we should show through actions that are happening in our scenes what's going on inside the character's head without addressing it directly. She doesn't say, I'm scared or nervous. That think I'm a fool implies that. And so does the emptiness of it somehow made the work to come more daunting. Okay, so that's playing proxy to her nervousness. And that's what we want to do. We don't want to hit things square in the head. We want to imply instead. That's more satisfying for the reader because they get to experience it and figure that out for themselves instead of you beating them over the head with it. Internal monologue can also help digest the state of affairs. She, Viv, returned to the shop but found herself restless and pacing. She'd sent post for her most important delivery on her first day in the city, and while the coffee had shown up promptly, the other parcel had yet to arrive. With the shop repaired and cleaned and nothing upon which to expend her nervous energy, she felt thwarted. After weeks of steady work, and with Cal absent, her hands itched with the inactivity. At last, in exasperation, she gathered her notes into her satchel and hiked to the pub she'd visited on her first night in Thune. She sat at a table in the back, ordered a meal, and made increasingly irrelevant lists. When noon arrived, her meal remained half-eaten, and her nervous organizational efforts were in shambles. So she lunged from her seat, paid, and stalked back to the shop to wait. We're getting a sense of where the coffee shop stands. The livery is not completely done, but it's getting close, and Cal is off doing something else, and Viv can't do any more work currently, and so she's trying to make lists. So the state of affairs is things have reached sort of a midway point, a milestone in the renovation of the livery, and she's close to getting the delivery of the espresso machine that she's ordered, but it isn't here yet. And so we get a sense of who Viv is, but also where things stand. She can't get much further on her own. She has to wait for either Cal or equipment to show up. We see that over and over again here. She's restless and pacing. She's making lists, but they're pretty much irrelevant. She's wanting to expend her nervous energy, but has nothing to expend it on. So there will be certain points in your story where you're going to want to digest things in a similar way. You're going to want to let the reader know how far things have come, what has to be done still to get either the immediate goal or the final end goal, and what stands in the way. And internal monologue can help. Internal monologue can also reveal deception. And so here Viv is having a meal with Tandri, who is one of the coffee shop workers that she's now hired. So, she said as they waited on their meal, "Have you always lived here in Thune?" "No," replied Tandri, poised in her seat. "I've lived lots of places." The succubus then smoothly redirected. "And you're clearly not the cosmopolitan sort. Why Thune?" Viv thought about the ley lines, the real reason she'd chosen Thune, and figured that was thorny to explain. She settled on a truthful but less complicated response. "Research," she said. It's always very interesting to me when dialogue goes against what internal monologue says. There's something that the character is saying outwardly for whatever reason. They don't want to hurt someone's feelings, so they want to hide the truth for their own benefit. Whatever the reason, it gives a view of what that character is like if you can contrast those two things, right? And here, it's not outward deception. She's not exactly lying, but you can certainly be doing that in your own fiction. Okay, let's move on to physical beats. So physical beats live in a gray area. They're part action, they're showing the characters doing things while dialogue is playing out. They're also part dialogue. They embellish or can replace dialogue entirely, and they're part setting because the characters often are interacting with the setting around them. They work hand in hand with dialogue and internal monologue and make the scene come alive as the words between the characters play out. Generally speaking, you'll have a bit of setup, setting a dump of some size, as short as possible, hopefully. And then you'll be using the characters and their actions as they talk to keep that scene alive. I like to give the example of a strobe light. Setting will slowly dim in the reader's mind. We, again, get that setting up front as you set the scene before it truly begins, and it's very bright in the reader's mind at that point. And then as the dialogue starts to play out, it dims slowly until you have the characters interact with that setting again, and then it suddenly flashes. Maybe not as bright as in the beginning, depending on how much you put in, but certainly brightens it. And then it'll start dimming again. And so you just want to keep that scene alive by having the characters interact with it. The one exception to having an extra setting dump, more description, mid-scene is if the characters are on the move somehow and they come to some new place, some new setting that you're going to have to describe in some degree. Maybe heavily if it's something important, maybe lightly if it's not too important. So physical beats can keep the characters and setting alive. That's its main purpose. "Do you know who owns this place?" asked Viv, pointing back at the livery. The woman was less than half her height and had to crane to make eye contact. Her eyes disappeared as she compressed her face into a considering tangle of wrinkles. "The livery?" So this is Viv and Lainey, and we're keeping the setting alive by pointing back at the livery. We've already described that to some light degree, as we saw right in the beginning of this talk, and then Viv points back at it. So that just makes it come alive again in the reader's mind, and they kind of remember how far they are away from it, the relationship between the characters and the setting itself. And then we have the next two sentences in that middle paragraph. The woman was less than half her height. That's kind of description only, but had to crane to make eye contact. That is a physical beat because she's kind of like looking up at Viv, who's very tall, and Lainey is quite small. So we see that quite clearly. And then her eyes disappeared as she compressed her face into a considering tangle of wrinkles. Just really vivid, right? And so between these two bits of dialogue right at the beginning and the end, the scene is really coming alive for us, right? Beats can reveal character as well. So same example as before. "You handsome?" asked Viv. He allowed that he was. mind if I sit? And then the beat is, then sat anyway, leaning black blood against the back of the chair. So that sat anyway and leaning the sword is contrasting and complementing the internal monologue that follows. Truth be told, she wasn't really accustomed to asking permission. So it's all working in concert to embellish and define Viv more clearly for the reader. Beats can break up dialogue. Viv's smile was amused, her lower fangs prominent. Any idea where I can find him? Can't say for certain, but I imagine attendant to the only work he never failed at. She tipped her free hand, bringing an imaginary tankard to her lips. If you really want to find him, I try the places on Rawbone Alley. Head about 6 over. She gestured to the south. In the very beginning, Viv's smile was amused. Smiling, nodding, winking don't do a lot to tell us about the character and what they look like, but her lower fangs prominent absolutely do. It reminds us that Viv is this large, burly, strong orc. Then later we have the Lainey tips her free hand. We see that clearly, right? And then she gestures to the south, and that kind of brings the city back into focus during that scene. So 3 little bits that bring character and the immediate scene to life, but it also just breaks up the dialogue as well. Without those last couple of beats, that second paragraph could get kind of monotonous. Now, if it's only one bit of dialogue that's several sentences long, it's not anything to worry about, but you do want to keep in mind you want to break up long sections of dialogue where you can to, again, keep the scene itself fresh. Beats can also embellish dialogue. So again, do you know who owns this place? Asked Viv, pointing back at the livery. The livery? Yep. Well, Lainey dragged the word out thoughtfully, but Viv could tell there was nothing wrong with her memory. And so that little bit, she dragged the word out thoughtfully. It just helps us understand that, well, a little bit better. And so you can do that as well, kind of describe how the dialogue is being spoken in some detail if it's important, to that part of the story. Beats can also replace dialogue entirely. You think I need a watchful eye? Viv's brows rose. She's talking to Lack at this point, that shakedown artist. We all need someone to watch out for us, replied Lack. This is the part where you let me know about the monthly involuntary donation for, what did you call it? A beneficent eye? Lack cocked a finger at her, and his smile widened. Viv's brows rose. Says a lot. It says, I don't need help, but also that Viv is quite confident she can take care of herself. And then Lack cocked a finger at her, and his smile widened. Baldry didn't say, yes, you have it. That's exactly right. He did this instead. And so it just creates a nice amount of contrast during a scene to replace some dialogue entirely with physical beats. Okay, so let's talk about some tips and tricks. In general, we want to be as economical as possible with our stories. That means everything, not just dialogue, but certainly dialogue as well. So make your dialogue, as I mentioned before, pull its own weight by doing more than one thing at once. So I covered all those different purposes for dialogue, internal monologue, physical beats. And when I say dialogue here, I'm talking about all 3. So you want to make all of those bits do double, triple, quadruple duty if you can. And we've given some examples where that's true, so you can go and review those a little bit. Try to do that with your own scenes. Make them more muscular, more compact, more powerful because you're making it do more. Also remember that subtext is your friend. Readers will fill in a lot if you give them the broad brushstrokes. There's the old chestnut, which I believe in fully, that the writer brings 50% of the story to the table and the reader brings the other 50%. So you don't want to, nor can you really explain everything. You're trying to explain the important bits so that the reader can fill in the rest. You're not trying to create a photo with your spoken words or any other part of your story. You're trying to create an impressionist painting. So think of that exchange with Lack, the shakedown artist, where Viv clearly knows the sort of man he is. Baldry does that in a very economical way. We get the type of guy he is very quickly from Viv's reaction, and we also learn more about Viv along the way. It paints her as well by understanding the sort of man he is from the get-go. Another example of subtext. Viv turned carefully to Tandri and held the mug out. She has a cup of coffee she made. Here, go on. Careful though, it's hot. Tandri gravely took the mug and held it in both hands, tentatively sniffing at it. She brought the brim to her lips, blew on it for several seconds, and then took a very cautious sip. A long pause. Oh, said Tandri. Oh my. Viv grinned. This just might work. And so we've all had that sense of something. If not coffee, it could be tea or some other drink that you enjoy. And your first time that you had it, you're like, oh my goodness. And that sense is conveyed with that, oh my, from Tandri, like very clearly, and with just a couple of words, right? And then also Viv grinned, like she is remembering her first time, and now it's infecting somebody else, right? And so she's getting the sense that it might work. And so again, there's a sense of satisfaction on Viv's part that she's doing the right thing. And it's done, it's portrayed very economically by Baldry. Use dialogue tags sparingly, but do make clear who's speaking. Remember that said, asked, and replied are skimmed by the reader and nearly invisible unless you overuse them. Other speaking verbs can spice things up, but be careful about overreaching with things like she purred or he growled. Now, I'm not saying you can't use those. I'm not saying there aren't places for purred and growled in your story, but just view those kinds of verbs with a side eye and make sure that they really work in that part of your story. And if not, maybe said, asked is better. Keep dialogue, internal monologue, and action to distinct paragraphs for each character. In other words, when you're switching character, their actions, or their words, or internal thoughts, create a new paragraph so that the reader can understand that the POV or the character it's referring to has switched. Baldry is really good at that in Legends and Lattes, so you can use that as an example for how to do that well. Differentiate between narrator and POV character. The narrator's voice is often a bit more neutral and proper than the point of view character's actual words. So when Viv is speaking, she comes across a bit more rough and tumble than the narrator's words describing, say, Thune, the city, or the port she goes to find Cal. So if you had a character with a southern drawl, for example, that drawl would come out very apparently during their speech when they're talking to other people. It may show up as well, and probably will, in their internal monologue, but it would be less apparent during narration. So we're trying to make a distinction here between narrator, internal monologue, and external dialogue. Those will all be slightly different levels of dialogue, typically. So think about that as you're writing them. There will also be more stops and starts to dialogue, spoken words, than there will be in narration. You want to give a sense of real talk, real speech, and that includes stuttering, being interrupting yourself sometimes, versus narration, which is smoother in general. Change dialogue based on situation. I'll cover this a bit later in more detail, but you don't act the same toward your mom as you do your boss, as you do your drinking buddies, unless, of course, your mom is also your boss and you go out drinking after work. Keep these three things in mind. Who the character is, who's the point of view character, or who's speaking, their current mental state. It's not always the POV character we have to worry about here. It's also the others they're interacting with. And finally, who they're interacting with. Again, you're going to act differently towards different people based on your experiences with them or that type of person. Make clear who's speaking in one of four ways. Dialogue tags at the beginning, middle, end of dialogue. We all need someone to watch out for us. Replied lack. So dialogue tag at the end, but that could be, again, in the beginning or in the middle as well. You could also use physical beats with no dialogue tag. You think I need a watchful eye? No dialogue tag, and then Viv's brows rose. So we know it's Viv who's talking. Third way, implied tags through rapid fire exchanges. It's not a livery I'm wanting though. No, says Cal. Ever hear of coffee? He shook his head. Well, I need a restaurant, I guess, for drinks. And so here we're just going back and forth. Baldry has already set up before this point that they're going back and forth in their dialogue, and so he doesn't have to put a tag or even a physical beat on every single line. So you should rely on that. You yourself are just fine with that when you read that with other authors, so do that as well. Trust that your reader is going to pick up on that too, and you'll develop a sense over time of how far you can push this. You will eventually need to have some kind of tag or beat to identify who's talking, to reorient the reader, make sure they're still on track, but use this to move things along at a faster pace. And lastly, implied tags through diction. Don't know much about Ruffin, he said as he peered up at the hole. But you can figure it out? He replied, in what Viv was coming to understand was an affirmative. And so in this case, was used a couple of times before this point, where Viv recognizes that this is like a verbal tick on Cal's part. And then later, After this point, is used a couple more times again with no dialogue tag, and we get that that's Cal speaking because Baldry set us up to understand that's who it's from. And so if you set somebody up to have a certain style of talking, and then you use that style of talking after you've set it up a couple of times, the reader will get it, and they'll know who's talking without you bothering to put a dialogue tag in. Break your dialogue up by varying where tags are placed, again, beginning, middle, or end. Use vivid physical beats and vary their locations as well among the dialogue. Make the dialogue messy by having interruptions, pauses, stops, as a way to invite a response from another character, perhaps. By doing that, we make it feel more real to the reader. M dashes work in narration as a small aside, some embellishment, like, she felt awkward. So many people so close, and for the first time, she wasn't just passing through. But it can also be used in dialogue to break up the flow. A bunch of stray dogs spat Lainey. The madrigal's got the leash. Her wrinkles bunched tight around her mouth. But the madrigal ain't to be ignored. When they ask you to pay, she gazed sharply at Viv, and they will ask. You'd best bank your coals and pay. So here we're putting a little bit of weight to, and they will ask, by putting in that she gazed sharply at Viv. So it goes a long way to make this an interesting textured bit of dialogue, but also give some importance to, and they will ask. These people are dangerous, and Lainey is trying to make that clear to Viv. And it happens because of this little breakup. It's more weighty because of it. Remember that dialogue flows from character, but must also move plot. Look for ways for dialogue to complicate or further the plot. I talked about that triangle, character, world, and plot. Character and world are both going to advise the plot, and we want dialogue to help show that to the reader so they can be oriented, understand where things are headed, how far things have come, that sort of thing. Sometimes, many times, in fact, dialogue is the only tension in a scene. So look for ways to play out conflict through dialogue. Somebody wants something, somebody else wants to prevent them from getting it. Use dialogue to connote the passage of time during your scene. Physical beats can help because we pause the dialogue to show them doing something, and so a little bit of time passes while they're doing it. Points of ellipsis can help as well for people literally pausing their words. Dashes for dialogue interrupted by action or someone talking over them can help too to make it feel more real. Also, short and sharp sentences during high-tension scenes versus long, drawn-out monologues during perhaps lower-tension scenes. And so that will just help to convey how quickly things are happening by how short or long your dialogue is. Some things to avoid in dialogue. And again, always beware of rules. These are not hard and fast, and different situations and different stories will call for different approaches. And so just look at all rules with a side eye, but at the same time, at least consider them and see if they're appropriate for you. So as you're editing, you want to look for and avoid circular arguments. Look for places where the dialogue is essentially remaining static. They're kind of beating around the bush and things aren't escalating or de-escalating, and it goes on for too long. It's not moving the narrative, in other words. Try to tighten that exchange and get to the heart of the conflict between the characters faster by perhaps just cutting some of that stuff out. Avoid talking head syndrome. I kind of intimated this earlier, but long sections of dialogue with only simple tags and not enough physical beats will lead to a feeling of disembodied heads talking head syndrome. Watch out for crutches like she nodded or he shrugged or she shook her head no or he winked. Those are still kind of like just what they had, and they're not very descriptive. And so that can still lead to that kind of situation where the reader feels like they don't understand where this is happening anymore. In other words, that strobe light that we talked about has dimmed to the point where they've forgotten where these characters are. And you want to freshen it again. You want the strobe to flash again so that they can see the scene once again. So craft vivid physical beats where the characters are interacting with one another and the setting itself to keep that setting alive in the reader's mind. Adverbs. Adverbs can often be removed and a better verb chosen. That's mostly why that rule has been said by plenty of people. Instead of she walked quickly, just say she jogged or she ran. Instead of he said loudly, say he shouted or he bellowed. Try to replace all such occurrences, all adverbs, if you can. And the places where you feel like you can't, well, maybe that's a case where it does need to stay. I'm not saying you should have 0 adverbs in your copy. I'm saying you should have as few as possible, and you should be trying to convert those into more active, more vivid, stronger verbs in the end. Avoid common everyday greetings, partings, and so on. If you watch TV and scripts, movie scripts too, they're really good about this stuff because they only have so much runtime, and so they skip stuff like hello and goodbye. Like phone calls are always like, pick up, they start talking, they don't say goodbye, they just hang up. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Dialogue is a specialized subset of language. It's meant to be trim and to keep the story moving. So again, skip as much of that stuff as possible and get into and out of the conflict as fast as you can. Internal monologue tips and tricks. So as you write, keep in mind the purpose of internal monologue. It should embellish the spoken words with thoughts from the POV character. Perhaps complement the dialogue, providing some more detail on what was said, or maybe contrasting the dialogue, all with an eye toward entertaining the reader in the end. Maintain the same style and voice as external dialogue in your internal monologue. They may not be the exact same voice, but close. They should have some of the same tics and same general feel as each other. But avoid defaulting to the narrator's voice. Again, that's a different voice from the internal monologue and the spoken word of the character. The point here is that you don't want to become overly formal in internal monologue. That should have some flavor of the character still. Also complement dialogue to further the point of what they said. Provide more detail, reveal purpose or emotion. Contrast the dialogue to reveal a character's true intent, to show deception, to reveal their true personality, as opposed to the one that they're putting on towards others. Some things to avoid with internal monologue. Avoid filters like she thought or he thought. Just put the thought in line and the reader will understand it's from the point of view character. This implicit trust cuts down on words and helps the reader sink into the character more, because when they see something like she thought, then it puts them at one state of remove from that character. Instead of just thinking it and feeling themselves thinking it, they're being reminded that they're not that character. So just put that thought in line and it will help to draw the reader in. Avoid repetition. It's really common in newer writers to kind of encapsulate what was said during the dialogue in internal monologue, and you really want to avoid that. You should be using internal monologue in a way that embellishes what was said. It should be doing something different, though, than the spoken words. Physical beats, tips and tricks. So use physical beats to keep that setting alive. Again, get those characters interacting with the world and avoid talking head syndrome. Use them in place of dialogue tags to keep the narrative streamlined. Sprinkle them in to break up long sections of dialogue. Be inventive. Think of cool, fun, scary, sexy, what have you ways for the characters to interact with one another and the setting. And again, that strobe effect goes a long way to keeping the character invested in the story because they feel like they're in it, that they're experiencing it themselves. Vary the placement, again, to provide texture and keep scenes lively. Alter how many beats you're using based on the tone and mood. If it's more contemplative, you can back off of that a little bit. If it's a rapid fire exchange and you're trying to connote tension or a lively scene, well then add more. Some things to avoid with physical beats. So avoid cliches like nodding, shrugging, blinking, sighing, and also look for your blind spots. You may use the same types of physical beats over and over again, and you want to start picking up on those and changing them up. Be careful not to overuse them. Too many physical beats can lead to a running on railroads track effect where the scene feels like it's struggling to make progress or not progressing at all. The physical beats are just getting in the way. That strobe is too bright and we're not getting to the actual meat of the scene itself. So in some cases, you actually need to pull back on that. All right, so let's talk again about how the nature of the dialogue needs to change throughout your story. So dialogue will have a certain baseline for each character that's dictated by the tone of the story, the nature of the speakers, and the character's makeup, how you've defined them in other words. But dialogue has to change from that baseline based on the context, where it is in the story. So each character exchange must consider, again, who the character is, what kind of character they are, their past, their makeup, their current mental state, who they're interacting with in the story. And this applies to all characters, not just the POV character. So you're going to want to think about this for the people, the characters that the main character, the POV character, is interacting with as well. So consider how each character would act towards people they don't know very well, new acquaintances, and so on. Close family versus distant family. Friends and allies versus enemies and antagonists. Also consider their current emotional state, their purpose, and the stakes. So are they stressed or depressed or high on drugs? Are they in love with the character they're talking to? Are they searching for revenge? Are they in love and searching for revenge against the same person? How important is their goal to them? In other words, what is their view, their perception of the stakes? What do they fear will happen if they fail? That will absolutely affect how someone's going to act in that situation if they feel it's very important versus not important at all. Consider the part of the book that you're currently writing as well. Characters are often a bit more easygoing in the beginning because they don't understand the stakes yet, and they're more invested by the end. So the stakes become more and more clear. These stakes become more and more important to the main character as well, and therefore dialogue should be tighter and more focused the closer we get to the end of the story. And that will give the reader a sense that things have momentum, that we're reaching the end too. Some closing thoughts. You have to balance dialogue/internal monologue against narrative summary, description, and exposition. There's no one formula. Adjust based on your personal taste and what feels right for your story. If the story feels like it needs more engagement, consider converting some narrative summary or backstory into dialogue. Have characters work through that by talking to one another instead of just putting a dump on the reader. It can help turn a dull or dry passage into something snappy, funny, scary, sexy, what have you. There may also be cases where a section of dialogue or action isn't pulling its narrative weight. It's going on for too long. You can heighten the tension or mystery, which helps reader engagement, but also consider converting dialogue to narrative summary. Maybe it doesn't really need to be an interaction directly between characters that we see on the page. Maybe you can just summarize it and get to the next important thing in your story. So that can help you avoid pointless actions and words and keep the story moving. Remember that page space is very precious, and the words in your story should be worth it. Use as many words as you need to convey your story, but not a single word more. One way to accomplish that is by removing all unnecessary words during editing, but another is to make your words do as many things as possible at once. If you can do that effectively, it will allow you to trim elsewhere because you're conveying what you need in a shorter space and you're cutting some of that fat out. Dialogue, for example, can reveal character and show the immediate goal of the scene. It can reveal an emotional state and ratchet up tension at the same time. Making your words work harder helps with reader engagement, so fit as much as possible into your dialogue, internal monologue, and physical beats. Now that we've gone through all this, let me pass along some tips to improve your dialogue. So certainly analyze your favorite dialogue writers. Really look at what they're accomplishing based on some of the things that we've talked about. Why does their dialogue work so well? Keep in mind that analyzing writing in this way is as much about looking at what's there as what's not there. In other words, how did they make it so economical? What did they not put in as opposed to what they did put in? And that may help you understand where you are with your writing and what you can leave out and what you can replace that with to make your scenes more effective. So analyzing someone else's work can help sometimes. So look at a beta read that you've done for another writer where you don't feel the dialogue was done all that well. Look at it again and try to figure out what isn't working and how it could be improved. And then take a couple of pages of their manuscript and try to rewrite it a little bit in your style and with the tips that you have in mind, the things that you think could change to make it better. Just do it and see if that teaches you anything about how you should do your own dialogue. And then do the same with your own work. Once you've gotten a bit better at understanding how to look at scenes and dialogue critically, you can do that with your own work a little bit better. So take some pages where character interaction feels lifeless or dull, maybe based on others' comments on your work. Determine what's working well and what isn't, and try to learn some lessons from that. And then rework the dialogue, the internal monologue, and the physical beats with those lessons in mind. I'll close with this one final tip. Read your work aloud. Dialogue especially benefits from being read aloud during edits. It's true of all writing, and you'll find a ton of mistakes in other places by doing so, but you'll be able to pick up on tone and find clumsy exchanges in dialogue, especially when you read it aloud. So take the time to do that on one of your drafts, one of your editing passes. Dialogue, internal monologue, and physical beats are a huge part of narrative fiction. Try to make all three of them do as many things as possible on your first draft, of course, but then look for ways to make them even stronger on subsequent drafts. Find the right balance between dialogue, narration, description, and exposition for your story. I hope that showed you what dialogue, internal monologue, and physical beats can do, and also gives you some ideas on how to better use each of them to create powerful scenes with lively dialogue that really help the scene come alive. As always, if you found this talk useful, I hope you'll like and share with other writers and writer groups especially. That really helps to grow the channel. I have a ton of videos I hope to tackle soon, including a mastering fiction video on setting, a deep dive into Scrivener's metadata features, and more. So be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss anything. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.